Welcome to Venn diagrams, where we'll be looking at different ways of representing the time that you have in a typical week. And so your goal is to take 168 hours that you would spend in a week, actually by tracking your actual time using different apps on your phone, fitness apps that keep track of what you're doing, or trying to do a typical average. And that really is your decision to start with. Does it make more sense for you to track exactly what happened this week and just have a snapshot of it? But if you know that this upcoming week won't be a typical week, then go and do an average or make some adjustments on that. For example, if being part of a sports team is normally a big part of your week, then you're going to, but it's not in the upcoming week, you want that to be included. If there's different extracurricular activities, leadership that you're part of, all of those different components should be included too. So I'm going to go through several examples in different approaches that students have done. I want to give a really clear expectation as to what's an 80% example versus a 100% example, and then from there leave it really open to you having freedom to decide which format you want to go with, what kind of style is there. This Venn diagram task I actually started 12 years ago, and this is how it began. Just doing a quick little activity where we sketched it for about 5 minutes in class, did some rough estimations, and then from there, students went in, either did hand drawing for it, and then others went and used the computer to do something like this. Notice no numbers, no percents, approximations at best, but still, a valuable activity. What I like about this activity is every time I do it with students, someone has a better idea on how to improve it, and then that example becomes kind of an inspiration for future classes. So starting about 8 years ago, while we were working on it, a student went over to a computer and set up a spreadsheet and used the percent calculations, their automatic percent calculations, and that just gave a much better number and a way of quantifying it. And that's what most of you will do, is use the technology rather than just a scrap of paper. Some were very complex. Fortunately, technology has improved on the design side. Both Microsoft Word and InDesign have Venn diagram programs where you can actually use an automated program to do it. At this point, it was being done just kind of through paint, circles, shape making kind of things. But I like how this one gets into the complexity of some overlap. Music was a huge part of this person's life, as was movies. So this is very different than other ones, but it allows you to see why they place that in their center as a priority, but also because practically it worked better to frame it. This example would be your 60, 70% absolute max. When you look at this, the ratios aren't there. This circle and this circle are not the same size, but are both at 7 hours. The most obvious error here is that this homework at 8 hours is almost half the size of this one at 9. Okay, so those are some of the issues. This is one of my favorite examples because of the realness of it. Format, obviously an issue. No numbers here. But they got the idea of the overlap, and that you can't just take a couple of circles and put them to the side there. So also a person that did a lot of camping, MSN being one of the original kind of technology messenger services that were there, so a bit of that. But notice the intentionality here of this portion of the camping. What is it not overlapping with that you'd normally think about with camping? This is camping by himself. This was a person that was just an outdoor adventure kind of person. And yes, at times it was with friends, at times it was with family. I believe they did this for a more typical week in the summer, but they would go off fishing, hunting by themselves, and that was a big part of it too. And now into kind of some of the more classic examples here. This is a clear 100%. I like the simplicity of the format, showing the Venn diagram total of 168 hours. Friends in the background, building on different layers of overlap, hours and percents. And this was a significant change that was made about 4 years ago when students were doing this, and recognizing that the background should be in ratio to show sleep. The whole sleep component's a tricky one to actually put in without it just being the default. And if you look at his background, does that beige background cover about 25% of the space? I think it's pretty close. So these aren't things I'll measure. When you're designing circles and doing the ratios, I'm not going to sit there measuring the circumference of your circle or the area of the circle and seeing if that's in ratio. But practically, if you have two 20-hour circles, they should be the same size. And I'd say the biggest component is to make sure that the sleep component or whatever you're going to do shows in the background. My understanding is that some of the automated Venn diagram programs just do labeling and do the shading kind of in the background. So you will need to size it. Yeah. And again, do not do formal calculations on that. Yeah, you don't have to take a number and then make the radius of the circle or anything like that, just by eye. And when I look at these, I mean, visually, when I mark them, I want to see that a 14 to 21 hour circle to an 8-hour circle are in a good logical ratio. Yeah, and that does it. Here's kind of the standard for an 80% example. The numbers are there, the ratios are good, the calculation's good. They've taken a piece of their spreadsheet and put it in. So all components are there, but visually it's not strong. And so if we just kind of flip back and forth between these two examples here we're into 100% publishing worthy, very well placed, logical, and this one feels a little bit more accidental. There's no reason why these needed to be situated this way. Even to go, when you have no overlap between these pieces, you could go and adjust them to have them into different spots rather than trying to cram all the little components in. Or perhaps you just make a category here that shows bus and where the music is inside of that. Okay, so you do need to make decisions to make sure that it's effective and looks good. Okay, the rest of the examples are just an assortment. Most of these are at 100% level. Why I'm showing a whole bunch of them is just to get the sense that you do have options here. Really, my only criticism with this one is that it has no component of sleep, or at least some explanation. This could have just had an overall title with a little subtitle that referenced the sleep portion, but I think the overall part is effective here. So my only improvement to this would be to have the proper box of a Venn diagram, a title, and then having this information put into the subtitle to really draw attention to it. Star Wars was a big part of Adam's life. Again, weekly basis, right? Suggesting that 21% of his week is watching reruns of Star Wars, various cartoon versions, and those kind of components. It was part of his spare. See it showing up in different components here. And I believe that this was a snapshot of 1 week, not an averaging. And so this just kind of shows, okay, maybe a little too much on Star Wars for 1 week. You are not limited to the standard rectangle of a Venn diagram. In this case, Matthew Reed decided to go more with a circle component. Those of you that lead complex, extroverted lives, friends dominate so much of it. If I was to do my Venn diagram, it's very simple. I keep my worlds separate. I do not mix school and friends. Family is separate. It's kind of, I have my components that I go through my life with. But this is not the case. Matt was a highly extroverted person, estimating 100 hours a week with friends. For a lot of you, yours would never look like this. When you were at school, there are times you were on school mode. Matthew was the kind of person that you would just never see by himself, and even when they were working, it was always talking, interacting, that kind of thing. Some of these items don't mean it's what your priority is, but it's a reality of time. So church for him was 2 hours, which makes it look insignificant, but it's a reality that his church experience was about 2 hours a week. And for others, that could be more. Some people will choose, like if your faith is a big priority in your life, there's nothing wrong with that being a way bigger bubble that includes the fact that a Christian faith component is often a big time thing, but it's not a specific event, right? And so what time are you involved with different youth groups, any kind of prayer, devotion, worship, singing, those kind of components too. And as you look at this, you start to see some really kind of fun things that emerge, or interesting things that emerge here. Completely singing inside the shower. Some really complex things with eating and food here. And then the sleep being the outside, but recognizing that I think this was done while different tournaments were happening with sports. And so he has a sleep component inside here, recognizing like at hotels, that kind of thing, while they were part of their sporting events. This is an example where Jessica worked really hard to simplify a complex situation, and after a couple of attempts, realized that she had to have computer, homework, friends go in this style to make the other components fit in. Very clean format, very publishing worthy. My only challenge here would be her sleep component is the background 45% of the space. So she just needed to have more of a larger border, spread some of these components out a little bit. This person really struggled with how to deal with the sleep component because they said what might be traditional sleep for me is insomnia, trying to sleep, poor sleep, poor quality. And I love how the format on this isn't amazing, but I love the effectiveness of this dashed black line as it goes down to show that at best, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and realize I had 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep. And then the rest of that would be a very disturbed, tossing and turning kind of sleep at best. This component she was going to break down more. It was getting too complex on the diagram, so just went to her phone saying to her, 20 hours is your average screen time. And as some of you will get, like I have an alert that comes to my phone that says how much my screen time has increased or decreased on a weekly basis. And so she was getting it ranging between kind of 18 to 25 and decided that 20 was a good explanation on that. For those of you that lead complex lives, I encourage you to put the extra work into representing that. And really the solution here is often a very simple legend. And you see a bit of a theme of obsessive compulsive. I'm using too strong of a word maybe here, or just that kind of overwhelmed component that comes through. The washing hands was the first flag to me. See that going through. Frequent checks of EDSB. And then I think a real self-awareness that there is time spent each week doing nothing other than feeling overwhelmed or obsessing. I had a student once that had averaging 2 hours a week, so about 14 hours of procrastinating. And they said that sadly there was almost no overlap with it. Yeah, that it was just kind of time being like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. Yeah, and looking at how much that likely was over the period of a week. A few more examples. These are some of the online programs that are used. So you see that they give you a very clear format. A lot of them, for whatever reason, default to pastel colors, which I'm not entirely sure is the best way. But this person actually added another variable, and that's using colors to show a theme. So look at the light blue versus the reddish versus the purple. A component with others, school component, and then outside of school component. There's something about this that I think is highly effective than just choosing random colors for each category. So by most of them that we've looked at have had 10 to 12 colors on it. This person went with 3 and is then able to bring in the connection between the other components that are there. This is a much older example, so technology-wise this was good at the time. And what she did was taking advantage of highlighting the overlaps by removing color from it. Okay, so with technology now, you could do a lot better with this. So you could see her time with her boyfriend Zach was obviously a big component, but this represented their spare that they had, their shared spare, time that they'd go over to Tim Hortons for every lunch with a group of friends. And I thought that was a really effective way of being able to show, yes, the overlap, or sorry, the different components, but especially isolating the overlap. So it's kind of my last advice on format would be not overusing color. Okay, so finding different ways to kind of step it back to draw in different themes here. Is this needed? Good labeling, especially with percents, the legend almost draws away from it. And you'll see that with some other examples too. I love the idea behind this, but the legend component, I think, draws away from it. Anytime you're forced to go back and forth and look at those colors, I like that they broke the tradition of circles. It works. The ratios work to a degree. I really like the Venn diagram component of recognizing that this is actually 21 hours, but broken up into the 18 and the 3. If this had been done double the size and switched from the vertical to the horizontal with the labels on it, could have been full marks. And just a couple of final examples here. Very effective design. Again, using colors to make links. So rather than having a technology bubble, this one worked better to break it into computer and phone, but the green color connects it. And unless you have a really convincing argument, I believe that both percent and hours need to be on it. But they don't have to be on every little component. One like this, starting to get a little bit cluttered, maybe some of the smaller components, you move the title outside of the circle, or you just have the 2 hours being represented and keep the percents for the larger pieces. So lots of options. We kind of use these to see how, what can be done. And here's Lucia living with a homestay, and then having her family be a very small component, all within the phone component. Here, she was debating how much of this to do is computer part, and whether it should be homework, whether it should be linked to school, and just decided that there was no point in wrecking the design by trying to combine a computer component here too. But what we've seen since is that someone would take this kind of off-orange color and just do a very small off-orange piece here that represents computer. And then that would have been enough. So having had a number of students approach this Venn diagram assignment, there's a couple things that I've learned from it. One is that the place to start is not with a spreadsheet. The place to start is with a scrap piece of paper and just writing down different things that you do in a week and getting approximate times. Or the place to start is with logging your time for a week and getting an actual representation of it. I think the second you start by putting numbers into a spreadsheet, you start to almost have a self-judgment where you're auto-correcting the numbers that you don't like, rather than just having the reality of what's there. So step one, track, estimate, try to get a sense. Step number two will be to go and put the numbers in. And you'll notice this person just said, I'm on the bus for an hour and a half one way, 5 times a week, twice a day. So they put a multiplication formula that's in there. The sleep one looks a bit more complicated because they're averaging 6 hours a day during a school week, but 7 hours on a weekend. So I like that rather than just saying, it's probably 50 hours, they're actually doing a bit of thought in putting those components in. So you can do that for lots of them. Over here on the percents, we'll use a basic percent total where you're locking it into the total in a week. So the total in a week being 168 hours. So the $ on the formula always locks it to that 168. And in this case, that is way more important than doing the traditional, which would be to lock it to the subtitle. You don't want to do that. We need to capture the fact of what percent of a week it is, not what percent of a total. So if this formula was linked to this number, this would always be 100, and we don't want that. Okay, we want to get a sense as to what the overlap is. So these are not realistic numbers here because it's showing an overlap of only 16%, and I think you would have to be one of the most introverted people possible with a completely isolated, separate lives to only have 16% overlap in what you do in a week. Also though, we have the sleep component. And so by clicking down on the 90%, You can see a formula that takes the C14 value and subtracts the C12 value, or C2 value, looking at sleep. And then what this does is tell you kind of what ratio the colored part of the Venn diagram, the circle part, is going to be. And my recommendation, unless you want to make your life way harder for yourself, is just keep sleep as the background. So if I know that my sleep is at 26%, I want about a quarter of the background to be blank, and then the circles to fill up the rest. This is an imperfect system, okay? It doesn't, as soon as you're dealing with the overlap, there's a subjective part that comes in here. Is the data realistic? It's not going to be perfect because we're bringing this down to a couple of categories. My final recommendation, I'd say minimum 12 categories. I think if you do less than that, you're combining too much and you don't get into the complexity of your life. But I would also say 15, 20 as the absolute max, because otherwise the Venn diagram becomes so cluttered that it doesn't give that visual snapshot that's there.